Today we're going to set up a basic task management API. First, we'll create a new model. Think of a model as a blueprint that holds various data types. We'll name our model task and add 2 fields to it. A description field to describe the task details, which will be a text field. And a complete field to mark the task as done, which will be a Boolean. We'll now click Create. On the model page, you can create new fields, edit existing fields, and delete unwanted fields. Next, we'll create a data store for our model, a secure and organized space to save all of our task data. Just click the Create Data Store button and confirm. Let's quickly view our newly created data store. Our task data will be held here once we start adding tasks. In the data store, you can view, edit, delete, and export data as you please. Now that we have created a data store, we are able to create CRUD operation endpoints for our task. This saves a lot of time by automatically generating create, read, update, and delete functions and endpoints for this task model. We will now select all of the operations. Retrieve multiple tasks. Retrieve a single task using a task ID, which is automatically generated when creating a task. A create endpoint where we will create a task. Edit so we can edit an existing task. And finally, delete. Twidget will automatically generate the endpoints, class, and functions for this model for you to use. You can view the resources generated by clicking on any of the links in the results model. You can see we have a new class called task CRUD functions that was generated. In this class, we have all of the functions needed for our endpoints, from retrieving a task to deleting a task. All of the functions are editable, so you can customize them to fit your business needs. For now, we'll leave them as the defaults. You can view all of the generated endpoints. The delete, put, post, and to get endpoints to retrieve all of the tasks or an individual task. For now, we'll click on the create task endpoint. This endpoint shows all of the inputs required, as well as the endpoint path, method, and description. For the create task endpoint, we'll only need a task body. The body is set as an argument for the create task function, which will use the body to create the task data. By default, the endpoint requires authentication to use. This stops your API being public to everybody. You can disable authentication if you want your endpoint to be public. Let's now test the endpoint. You can see the full endpoint URL. Please note that this URL is a test URL and only accessible from within Twidget. Your final API will be available only after building the API and deploying it. Since our endpoint requires authentication, a test authentication token will be provided to allow requests to be made successfully. In the data text box, we can now add information about the task we would like to create. We will update the description to create new task and leave complete as false, as the task is not yet ready to be complete. Now let's send the request. We've received a 200 response, which tells us the request has been successfully complete and a task has been made. The response will show us the task we created with additional data such as the ID and timestamps for the task creation. In the lower panel, you can view the response headers from the test API. We'll also create a few additional tasks. We'll now look at the retrieve all tasks endpoint to view the newly created tasks. This endpoint shows all of the tasks we have created. It runs the get task function and returns a list of tasks. We'll send a request to the test endpoint to see all of the tasks we have previously created. We would like to complete the first task we created. To do so, we'll copy the task ID and navigate to the update tasks by ID endpoint. This endpoint takes a task ID as one of the path variables. We'll click test and pass through the copy task ID as the path variable. Since we only want to update the completed field, we'll remove the description field and change the complete status to true. We'll now send the request. You can see that the task has now been updated to complete. The two final endpoints are similar, where you will only have to provide the task ID. First, let's show the retrieve task by ID. Let's copy the task ID again and navigate to the endpoint. Click test and paste the copied task ID. The response is the task we just completed. Finally, let's navigate to the delete task endpoint. Click test, paste in the task ID, and click send. The response returns a 200 status without a body, which indicates the task was deleted successfully. Let's go back to the retrieve all tasks endpoint to confirm that the task was deleted. You can now see we have 3 tasks instead of 4, and the completed task does not appear. Before we proceed, we want to remove authentication on this endpoint so we can test our public API without the need to authenticate. You can also view all of the created tasks in the tasks data store. Navigate to data stores and click the task store. Hit refresh. And now you can see all of the previously created tasks. All of the data in the data store is fully editable and can all be exported. Now that we have tested all of our endpoints, we'll want our API accessible publicly. To do so, we'll need to build our API. Click build in the top bar of the app. This will open the build pipeline, where we can deploy our API to the cloud. We can choose our API memory limit as well as the desired replica amount. Let's kick off the build by clicking Start Build. Our pipeline will go through all of the build steps to confirm our functions have been created properly, endpoints and other resources are valid, and the API is running in a healthy state. You can view the progress of the build and see if there are any errors in the logs. Now that our API is deployed, let's test out the public API. You can click on the API available link in the logs to open the API client. Here you can test any public API in a similar fashion to the endpoint tester. We want to test the retrieve tasks endpoint, which is a get endpoint and has a path of /task. We've removed authentication from this endpoint, so we can leave authorization as none. Now we'll click send. We can now see the tasks that were previously created. This API URL is publicly accessible outside of Twidget, so can be used with any client of your choosing.